The earliest recoverable Christian evidence offers no indication of a publicly recognized celebration commemorating the birth of Jesus, which is today referred to as Christmas. This conclusion rests on an examination of the surviving literary and instructional materials produced by Christian communities during the 1st century AD. These sources, while limited in genre and scope, provide the clearest available window into what early Christians considered central to communal belief, practice, and memory. The Christian movement emerged within the Roman Empire in the decades following the execution of Jesus of Nazareth, commonly placed around AD 30. The earliest surviving Christian writings were not designed to catalog festivals or calendar observances. Instead, they addressed instruction, correction, identity, and continuity within small and often precarious communities. Nevertheless, the content and emphases of these writings allow historians to reconstruct, with caution, the contours of early Christian practice. The earliest datable Christian texts are the letters attributed to Paul, composed between approximately AD 50 and AD 60. These letters were addressed to established Christian communities across several regions, including Asia Minor, Greece, and Italy. Paul's correspondence addresses internal disputes, ethical conduct, communal discipline, and theological instruction. He refers repeatedly to practices such as baptism, communal meals, teaching, and regular assemblies. Within this material, Paul consistently emphasizes the death and resurrection of Jesus as the foundation of Christian belief. He references Jesus' crucifixion, burial, resurrection, and anticipated return. These themes recur across multiple letters written to different communities and contexts. Paul also demonstrates a readiness to address practices he considers significant, controversial, or in need of regulation. What Paul does not mention is equally instructive. He provides no reference to a celebration of Jesus' birth, no mention of a birth date, and no indication of an annual observance tied to Jesus' nativity. This silence cannot, on its own, exclude the possibility of undocumented private reflection or local custom. However, it does indicate that no birth celebration functioned as a public, regulated, or contested practice within the communities Paul addressed. If such an observance had existed at the level of communal importance occupied by baptism, the communal meal, or resurrection belief, its total absence from the correspondence would be difficult to explain. The next major body of evidence consists of the canonical Gospels, written between approximately AD 70 and AD 95. These texts were composed for instruction and proclamation rather than for modern historical biography. Their structure and content reflect theological priorities rather than comprehensive chronological narration. Two of the four Gospels, Matthew and Luke, include narratives describing the circumstances surrounding Jesus' birth. These accounts serve specific literary and theological functions. Matthew situates Jesus within Jewish scriptural tradition and royal lineage. Luke places the birth within a broader imperial context, referencing Roman authority and administrative practices. Neither gospel assigns a date to the birth, nor do they suggest that the event should be commemorated through a recurring festival. The other two gospels reinforce this pattern. Mark begins with Jesus' public activity and omits any birth narrative entirely. John opens with a theological prologue emphasizing pre-existence rather than historical birth circumstances. Across all four Gospels, no instruction is given for an annual commemoration of Jesus' birth, and no liturgical framework is implied. This absence is significant but must be framed carefully. The Gospels include birth narratives without transforming them into ritual prescriptions. The presence of narrative material does not, by itself, indicate the existence of a corresponding celebration. In the first-century Christian context, narrative explanation and liturgical observance operated as distinct categories. Additional late first-century Christian texts reinforce this conclusion. The Didache, commonly dated to the late 1st century and likely reflecting Syrian or Palestinian Christian communities, provides explicit guidance on communal practice. It addresses baptism, fasting days, prayer, ethical conduct, and communal meals. The text specifies particular days for fasting and patterns of worship. It contains no reference to a celebration connected to Jesus' birth. While the Didache does not represent all Christian communities, it demonstrates that at least some early groups regulated their communal life without reference to a nativity feast. Similarly, 1 Clement, written from Rome to Corinth around AD 95, addresses issues of leadership, order, and communal discipline. The letter repeatedly invokes Jesus' suffering and resurrection as foundations for unity and conduct. It offers no reference to a birth celebration or a commemorative calendar tied to Jesus' nativity. Given the letter's concern with communal order, its silence on such a practice suggests that no nativity observance required explanation, correction, or reinforcement at that time. Evidence for early Christian temporal structure further supports this pattern. By the end of the 1st century, Christian communities were gathering regularly, most commonly on the first day of the week. These gatherings included reading of scripture, instruction, prayer, and communal meals. In addition, there is early evidence for the development of Paschah, the commemoration of Jesus' death and resurrection in relation to the Jewish Passover. While the precise form and timing of Paschah were not yet standardized and would later become a matter of debate, its emergence as a central observance is clear. No comparable evidence exists for a celebration of Jesus' birth during this period. There are no calendars, inscriptions, sermons, or instructional texts from the 1st century that attest to a nativity feast. This absence appears consistently across the surviving evidence from different regions of the Roman Empire. It is important to define the limits of this conclusion precisely. The absence of documentary evidence does not allow historians to assert that no individual Christian ever privately reflected on the birth of Jesus or informally marked it within a household or local setting. What can be stated with confidence is narrower and more defensible. No recoverable evidence indicates a publicly recognized, communal, or institutional celebration of Jesus' birth in the 1st century AD. The priorities reflected in early Christian sources help explain this situation. The earliest Christian proclamations centered on the belief that God had acted decisively through Jesus' death and resurrection. These events were treated as the turning point of history and the foundation of communal identity. Time was organized around remembrance of resurrection and expectation of future fulfillment, not around origins or birth anniversaries. Within the Jewish tradition of the period, birth narratives could carry theological meaning without generating recurring liturgical observance. Within Roman society, birthdays were known but were most publicly associated with elites and rulers. Early Christian communities, often marginal and lacking institutional stability, did not organize their communal life around such observances. By the end of the 1st century AD, Christianity had spread across multiple regions and linguistic environments. Despite this diversity, The surviving evidence shows no trace of disagreement over how or when to celebrate Jesus' birth. The absence of controversy itself suggests that the question of a nativity feast had not yet entered the sphere of communal Christian practice. The absence of a celebration commemorating the birth of Jesus in the first century did not occur in a cultural vacuum. Early Christianity developed within two overlapping environments: the religious traditions of Second Temple Judaism and the social customs of the Greco-Roman world. Understanding these contexts is essential for explaining why a nativity feast did not emerge during the first generations of Christian history, without assuming either prohibition or neglect. Early Christian communities were formed primarily from Jewish populations in Judea, Galilee, and the Eastern Mediterranean, before expanding to include non-Jewish adherents across the Roman Empire. The earliest Christian leaders, texts, and practices emerged from this Jewish matrix. As a result, early Christian attitudes toward time, memory, and commemoration were shaped in significant measure by Jewish religious patterns. Within Second Temple Judaism, religious time was organized around events understood as acts of divine intervention in history. Annual observances such as Passover, weeks, and tabernacles commemorated collective experiences of deliverance, covenant, and provision. These festivals were not tied to the births of individuals, even figures of major religious significance. The Hebrew Scriptures contain narratives of notable births, Isaac, Samuel, and others, but these stories functioned as theological explanations within a broader narrative framework. They did not generate recurring liturgical celebrations marking the date of birth. This distinction is important. Jewish tradition did not lack interest in origins or genealogies, but it did not treat birthdays as occasions for communal religious observance. Religious meaning was attached to covenantal events, acts of deliverance, and moments of divine instruction, not to anniversaries of birth. Early Christians inherited this orientation towards sacred time, even as they reinterpreted Jewish traditions in light of their belief in Jesus as Messiah. At the same time, early Christianity expanded within the Greco-Roman world, where birthday celebrations were known and practiced. However, these celebrations were not evenly distributed across society. Public birthday observances were most visible among elites, patrons, and rulers. In imperial ideology, the birthday of the emperor could function as a civic event, reinforcing loyalty and hierarchy. Inscriptions, calendars, and public ceremonies sometimes marked imperial birthdays as moments of political significance. For ordinary households, birthdays could be noted privately, but they did not generally carry public religious weight. In literary sources from the Greco-Roman period, birthday celebrations appear most prominently in association with rulers, philosophers, and notable figures. This cultural pattern mattered for early Christians, who often defined their identity in contrast to imperial values and elite social norms. Early Christian writers show awareness of this association. In later centuries, some Christian authors would explicitly criticize birthday celebrations as characteristic of pagan or imperial culture. While such critiques are not securely attested in the first century, The broader cultural association between birthdays and elite self-promotion likely contributed to early Christian disinterest in adopting birth commemorations as communal religious practice. Early Christian emphasis instead rested on death, suffering, and vindication. This emphasis is already visible in the earliest sources. The memory of Jesus' execution under Roman authority shaped Christian identity in ways that a birth narrative could not. Death marked the point of witness, fidelity, and confrontation with power. Resurrection marked divine validation. These events, rather than the circumstances of birth, structured early Christian teaching and communal memory. This orientation toward death rather than birth also aligns with patterns visible in early Jewish and Greco-Roman commemorative practices. In both cultural spheres, the date of death often carried greater memorial weight than the date of birth. In Jewish tradition, remembrance of the dead focused on lineage, covenantal continuity, and collective memory rather than annual celebration. In Greco-Roman society, philosophers and notable figures were often remembered on the anniversary of their death, marking the completion of a life rather than its beginning. As Christianity developed, this pattern would later shape the commemoration of martyrs, whose deaths were recorded and remembered as moments of testimony. The emphasis on death as a moment of meaning predates the formal development of martyr cults and reflects a broader cultural logic already present in the 1st and 2nd centuries. Early Christian sources from the late 1st and early 2nd centuries reinforce this framework. Writings attributed to figures such as Ignatius of Antioch, composed in the early 2nd century, emphasize obedience, unity, and faithfulness in the face of persecution. Ignatius repeatedly frames Christian identity in terms of imitation of Christ's suffering and death. He does not reference a birth celebration or a commemorative calendar centered on Jesus' nativity. Similarly, early apologies and instructional texts focus on moral conduct, belief, and communal order rather than ritual cycles tied to Jesus' life events. Where time is marked, it is marked through regular gatherings and fasting practices, not through annual celebrations of origin. It is also necessary to consider the social position of early Christian communities. During the 1st and 2nd centuries, Christianity lacked legal recognition and institutional stability. Communities were small, often meeting in private homes. Leadership structures were developing gradually, and regional variation was significant. In this context, the development of elaborate festival calendars would have been impractical and potentially risky. Public celebrations required visibility, coordination, and often official tolerance. Annual festivals could attract attention and scrutiny. Early Christian communities, operating without legal protection for much of this period, focused instead on practices that could be sustained quietly and consistently. Weekly gatherings, shared meals, instruction, and mutual support. The absence of a nativity feast during this period should be understood not as a theological rejection of birth narratives, but as a reflection of practical, cultural, and religious priorities. The birth of Jesus was acknowledged and narrated, where it served explanatory or theological purposes. It was not elevated to the status of a recurring communal observance. This distinction becomes clearer when examining how early Christians treated other aspects of Jesus' life. Teachings, parables, and actions were preserved and transmitted orally and in writing. These elements shaped instruction and moral guidance. They did not automatically generate festivals. The early Christian movement did not operate with the assumption that significant events required annual commemoration. The gradual expansion of Christianity into predominantly non-Jewish regions during the 2nd century did not immediately alter this pattern. While Gentile converts brought different cultural backgrounds, the leadership and instructional traditions of Christian communities remained shaped by inherited Jewish frameworks and by the movement its own developing identity. Adoption of Greco-Roman social customs occurred selectively and unevenly, often filtered through ethical and theological evaluation. By the end of the 2nd century, Christianity had grown in numbers and geographical reach. Communities existed across North Africa, Asia Minor, Syria, Greece, and Italy. Despite this expansion, there is still no evidence of a universally recognized celebration of Jesus' birth. The absence remains consistent across regions, even as other practices began to show greater diversity. This consistency suggests that the lack of a nativity feast was not the result of accidental oversight in one location, but reflected a broader pattern of early Christian religious life. Birth celebrations did not occupy a functional role within early Christian timekeeping. They were neither necessary for instruction nor useful for communal cohesion within the movement's existing structures. It is important to avoid attributing motives that cannot be demonstrated. Early Christians did not necessarily reject birth celebrations as inappropriate in principle. The evidence supports a narrower conclusion. Birth celebrations were not prioritized, institutionalized, or regulated within early Christian communities of the 1st and 2nd centuries. By the late 2nd century AD, Christianity had entered a new phase of development. The movement was no longer limited to small, loosely connected communities transmitting belief primarily through oral teaching and occasional correspondence. Christian intellectual life was expanding, particularly in urban centers such as Alexandria, Rome, Antioch, and Carthage. With this expansion came new forms of inquiry, including attempts to situate Christian belief within broader frameworks of history, chronology, and cosmology. It is within this context that the discussion of Jesus' birth date first appears in the surviving record. These discussions, however, remain speculative and theoretical, and they did not yet result in a liturgical celebration. During this period, Christian writers increasingly engaged with the intellectual tools of the Greco-Roman world. Chronology was one such tool. Philosophers, historians, and scholars of the Roman world frequently calculated timelines, correlated events across different calendars, and sought symbolic meaning in numerical patterns. Jewish intellectual traditions had also long employed chronological reasoning, especially in the interpretation of scripture and sacred history. Christian thinkers inherited and adapted both traditions. The earliest surviving evidence for discussion of Jesus' birth date appears in the writings of Clement of Alexandria, active around AD 190 to 215. Clement was a teacher and theologian working in Alexandria, a city known for its libraries, schools, and scholarly culture. His audience consisted largely of educated Christians engaged in philosophical inquiry. Clement's writings are therefore representative of an elite intellectual environment, not of Christian practice as a whole. In his work Stromata, Clement notes that certain Christians had proposed specific dates for Jesus' birth. He records several suggestions, including dates in May and April, and mentions a group that calculated the birth to November 17th. Clement presents these calculations descriptively, not prescriptively. He does not endorse one date over another. nor does he suggest that any of these dates were celebrated liturgically. His tone indicates that these were exercises in calculation and curiosity rather than elements of communal worship. The significance of Clement's testimony lies not in the dates themselves, but in what they represent. By the late 2nd century, some Christians were beginning to ask when Jesus was born, not for the purpose of establishing a feast, but as part of a broader interest in situating Jesus within sacred history. The diversity of proposed dates underscores the absence of an inherited tradition. No single date carried authority, and no communal observance accompanied these calculations. Other Christian writers of the period confirm this pattern indirectly. Irenaeus of Lyons, writing around AD 180, devoted extensive effort to establishing the sequence of Jesus' life, particularly the duration of his ministry. He argued, controversially, that Jesus lived into his 40s, basing this claim on interpretive readings of Scripture. Irenaeus' concern with chronology demonstrates growing interest in historical sequencing, yet he does not mention a birth celebration or date. Tertullian of Carthage, writing in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, engaged in detailed chronological argumentation concerning Jesus' death. Tertullian calculated the date of the crucifixion by correlating Roman consular records with Jewish Passover chronology. He concluded that Jesus died on March 25th. This calculation would later prove influential, but in Tertullian's own work, it served apologetic and theological purposes, not the establishment of a festival calendar. A key chronological concept circulating during this period was the idea that significant figures experienced conception and death on the same calendar date. This notion was not uniquely Christian. It appears in Jewish interpretive traditions and in broader Greco-Roman symbolic thought, where numerical symmetry was often associated with completeness and divine order. Within Christian contexts, this idea was applied retrospectively to Jesus. If Jesus' death was calculated as occurring on March 25th, then, according to this reasoning, his conception would also fall on March 25th. From this point, birth would follow 9 months later. This logic produces a birth date of December 25th. It is crucial to emphasize that this reasoning emerged as a theological and symbolic calculation, not as the preservation of historical memory. It reflects how Christian thinkers imposed meaning onto time, not how time was originally experienced. During the 3rd century, this chronological logic circulated alongside other calculations. Different regions used different calendars. Jewish lunar reckoning, Roman solar calendars, and local civic calendars coexisted. Converting between them introduced further variability. As a result, chronological speculation did not converge on a single authoritative outcome. At this stage, there is no evidence that any of these calculations resulted in a public celebration. No sermons survive from this period announcing a birth feast. No calendars list a nativity festival. No inscriptions record a communal observance. The distinction between chronological interest and liturgical practice remains clear. This distinction is further supported by the writings of Origen, active in the early 3rd century. Origen, another Alexandrian intellectual, explicitly criticized the celebration of birthdays, noting that such practices were associated with rulers rather than with righteous figures. While Origen's comments are polemical and reflect his ascetic outlook, they demonstrate that the idea of celebrating Jesus' birth was not normalized within Christian practice at the time. Origen does not address an existing Christmas celebration. He comments on birthdays as a category. Origen's position should not be overstated. His views do not represent all Christians, nor do they constitute an official prohibition. However, they confirm that birth celebrations were not embedded in Christian liturgical life during the early 3rd century. Had a nativity feast existed and been widely practiced, Origen's remarks would likely have addressed it directly. The broader structure of Christian worship during the 3rd century reinforces this conclusion. Evidence points to the continued importance of weekly gatherings, baptismal instruction, fasting practices, and the commemoration of Pacha. Martyrdom also began to occupy a growing place in Christian memory. The dates of martyrs' deaths were recorded and remembered as anniversaries, marking the completion of faithful witness. This development further entrenched the pattern identified earlier. Death, not birth, generated commemoration. It is also necessary to consider the institutional limitations of Christianity during this period. Although persecution was intermittent and varied by region, Christianity remained an illegal or marginal movement for much of the 3rd century. Public festivals required coordination, visibility, and in many cases civic approval. The absence of a nativity feast is consistent with these constraints, but it cannot be explained by them alone. Other Christian observances, such as Pacha, developed despite these limitations because they were rooted in inherited Jewish frameworks and central theological claims. The emergence of chronological speculation in the late 2nd and 3rd centuries represents a preparatory phase rather than the beginning of Christmas itself. Christian thinkers were increasingly comfortable engaging with calendars, history, and symbolic time. They were laying intellectual groundwork that would later make the establishment of a birth feast possible. Yet the decisive step, from calculation to celebration, had not yet been taken. This period also demonstrates the absence of a centralized authority capable of enforcing calendar uniformity. Christian communities operated with significant autonomy. Bishops exercised local influence, but no mechanism existed to impose a universal feast across regions. In such an environment, speculative dates could circulate without producing standardized practice. By the end of the 3rd century, Christianity had developed a richer intellectual culture and a more complex relationship with time. Discussions of Jesus' birth date existed, but they remained marginal. They did not displace the centrality of death and resurrection, nor did they reshape the structure of communal worship. The transition from chronological speculation to public celebration marks a decisive turning point in the history of Christmas. This shift does not occur gradually across the Christian world, nor does it arise organically from long-standing communal practice. It appears first in a specific place, within a defined administrative context, and at a measurable point in time. The earliest recoverable evidence places this development in Rome during the mid-4th century AD. By the early 4th century, Christianity had undergone a structural transformation. The period of intermittent persecution had ended with the Edict of Milan in AD 313, issued under Emperor Constantine. Christianity was no longer illegal. Christian communities could now meet openly, acquire property, and operate within the legal framework of the Roman Empire. This change did not instantly standardize belief or practice, but it created conditions in which institutional coordination, including the regulation of time and festivals, became possible. Rome occupied a distinct position within this transformed environment. As the imperial capital and a major administrative center, the city possessed long-established systems for managing civic time. Roman society relied on calendars that recorded consular years, public holidays, imperial anniversaries, and religious observances. These calendars were not private devotional tools. They structured public life. As Christianity gained official tolerance and increasing patronage, it entered this calendrical space. The earliest secure documentary evidence for a Christmas celebration is preserved in a Roman source known as the Chronograph of 354. This document is a richly illustrated calendar compiled in AD 354 for a Roman Christian named Valentinus. It includes multiple sections, among them a list of Roman consuls, civic festivals, and Christian commemorations. One section, known as the Depositio Martyrum, records dates associated with Christian observance. Within this material appears the entry, 8 Calendas Ianuarias Natus Christus in Bethlehem Judaea. On the 8th day before the calends of January, December 25th, Christ was born in Bethlehem of Judea. This entry reflects Roman practice in AD 336, making it the earliest securely attested reference to the celebration of Jesus' birth on December 25th. It is important to frame this evidence precisely. The Chronograph of 354 does not claim to have invented the celebration. It records an existing observance. However, no surviving source confirms the existence of a Christmas feast in Rome before this point. The year AD 336 represents the earliest demonstrable instance, not necessarily the absolute beginning of the practice. This distinction matters. Historians cannot assume continuity where documentation is absent. What can be stated with confidence is that by the mid-330s AD, a public, calendarically fixed celebration of the birth of Christ existed in Rome. This marks the transition from speculative chronology to institutional observance. The Roman context is central to understanding why this development occurred when and where it did. Rome was not merely another Christian city. It was a hub of administration, communication, and symbolic authority. Practices established in Rome carried weight beyond the city itself. At the same time, Roman Christianity had developed a strong interest in martyr commemoration, with carefully recorded dates of death and burial for prominent figures. The recording of sacred time was already part of Roman Christian culture. The introduction of a birth feast fits within this broader pattern of temporal organization. Once Christianity was operating openly, it became necessary to define which events in Jesus' life warranted public remembrance. The death and resurrection were already central. The emergence of a birth feast reflects an expansion of the Christian temporal framework rather than a shift in core theology. The Roman Christmas represents a new development, shaped by 4th century conditions rather than inherited tradition. The selection of December 25th did not occur in a chronological vacuum. Theological calculations circulating in earlier centuries had already associated Jesus' death with March 25th. Within Western Christianity, what distinguishes the mid-4th century is not the appearance of this logic, but its institutional adoption. In Rome, theological calculation, administrative capacity, and public legitimacy converged. A date that had previously existed only in intellectual speculation now entered the civic calendar as a recognized Christian observance. The Roman Christmas also reflects the growing role of bishops in shaping communal practice. By the 4th century, episcopal authority had expanded significantly. Bishops were responsible not only for doctrine and discipline, but also for regulating worship. The establishment of a birth feast would have required episcopal approval and organizational support. particularly in a city as large and complex as Rome. The absence of controversy surrounding the Roman Christmas in surviving sources is notable. No 4th century Roman text records a dispute over the introduction of the feast. This silence suggests either that the development was broadly accepted within the Roman community or that dissent, if present, was not preserved in the surviving record. In either case, the absence of polemic distinguishes the introduction of Christmas from later calendar disputes, such as those surrounding the date of Easter. It is also important to note what the Roman Christmas did not immediately accomplish. The establishment of December 25th in Rome did not instantly produce universal adoption. Other Christian communities continued to operate according to different calendars and emphases. The Roman feast did not erase existing practices, nor did it settle the question of how the birth of Christ should be commemorated elsewhere. At this stage, Christmas remained a local observance, albeit one with the potential for wider influence. Its existence depended on the authority structures and administrative capacities of the Roman Church. Its meaning was shaped by Roman theological and calendrical assumptions. It did not yet function as a universal Christian feast. The Roman Christmas also did not replace other forms of observance related to Jesus' manifestation. In other regions, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean, different commemorations continued to dominate. The Roman development represents one trajectory among several, not an immediate standard. Before the mid-4th century, discussions of Jesus' birth date remained speculative and disconnected from communal worship. After the mid-4th century, at least in Rome, the birth of Christ had entered the public religious calendar as a fixed annual celebration. This development was made possible by changes in Christianity's legal status, institutional structure, and relationship to Roman civic life. It was not the result of recovered apostolic memory or uninterrupted tradition. It was a historical innovation, grounded in 4th century realities and documented in 4th century sources. The emergence of Christmas in Rome marks the beginning of the history of Christmas as a celebration, not the beginning of Christian reflection on Jesus' birth. That reflection had existed for generations. What changed in the mid-4th century was the decision to translate reflection into ritual and to anchor that ritual to a specific date within the public calendar. The consequences of this decision would unfold unevenly over the following centuries. The Roman feast would spread, encounter alternatives, and eventually become dominant. Those processes belong to the next phase of the narrative. Here, the record allows a precise conclusion. Christmas enters documented history as a public observance in mid-4th century Rome, under conditions shaped by imperial legality, administrative capacity, and developing ecclesiastical authority. The celebration of Christmas in mid-4th century Rome occurred within a broader transformation of how time, religion, and public life were organized in the Roman Empire. The selection of December 25th as the date for the celebration of Christ's birth cannot be understood in isolation from this environment. It reflects the convergence of Christian theological chronology with existing Roman structures of civic time and symbolic meaning. This convergence does not imply direct imitation or simple replacement of pagan festivals. It reflects a process in which Christian institutions began to operate within and reinterpret an already established temporal framework. During the 3rd century AD, Roman civic life was structured by a complex calendar system that combined administrative necessity with religious symbolism. Roman calendars recorded consular years, public holidays, imperial anniversaries, and religious observances. These calendars were displayed publicly and used to coordinate legal proceedings, markets, and civic ceremonies. Time in the Roman world was not neutral. It was organized, named, and invested with meaning through state authority. Religious symbolism played a significant role in this organization. Traditional Roman religious observances coexisted with newer cults and imperial religious initiatives. Among these was the cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered Sunday. While solar imagery had long been present in Roman religion, Sol Invictus received formal imperial promotion under Emperor Aurelian in AD 274. Aurelian established a temple to Sol Invictus in Rome and associated the cult with imperial unity and stability following a period of crisis. The precise details of Sol Invictus observance are not fully documented. Surviving sources indicate imperial support and public visibility, but they do not provide a complete festival calendar. Later Roman calendars associate December 25th with the dies natalis of the sun, though the extent to which this date functioned as a widespread public festival remains a subject of scholarly discussion. What can be stated with confidence is that by the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, solar symbolism occupied a prominent place in Roman imperial ideology, particularly in connection with ideas of renewal, victory, and cosmic order. This symbolic environment formed part of the context in which Christianity was becoming increasingly visible and institutionally established. By the time Christianity gained legal recognition in the early 4th century, it entered a world where public time already carried religious and political meaning. Any new Christian observance introduced into this environment would necessarily intersect with existing symbolic structures. It is important to clarify what the evidence does and does not support. The selection of December 25th for Christmas should not be described as a simple act of copying a pagan festival. There is no surviving Christian text from the 4th century that states that Christmas was instituted to replace or supplant the cult of Sol Invictus. Nor is there evidence of a formal decree aligning the two observances. Claims of direct replacement arise largely from much later interpretations and modern polemics rather than from contemporary documentation. At the same time, it would be misleading to treat the overlap as coincidental or irrelevant. The 4th century Roman calendar already associated late December with themes of light, renewal, and cosmic order. Within this calendrical environment, Christian leaders did not select a date at random. They selected a date that could bear theological meaning and operate effectively within public time. Christian use of solar language predates the institutionalization of Christmas. Early Christian texts frequently describe Christ using imagery of light and illumination. Biblical language referring to light overcoming darkness or righteousness rising like the sun was already part of Christian interpretive tradition. These metaphors were theological, not astronomical, but they provided a conceptual bridge between Christian belief and existing symbolic vocabulary. By the 4th century, Christian authors increasingly employed this language in explicit contrast to non-Christian worship. Christ was presented as the true source of light, order, and salvation. This rhetorical framing did not require borrowing pagan ritual. It involved reinterpreting symbolic meaning within a Christian theological framework. The convergence of Christian chronology with December 25th reflects a process of symbolic appropriation, not ritual imitation. A date that already carried resonance within Roman public life was invested with new meaning. This process mirrors other aspects of Christian adaptation within the Roman world, including the use of basilicas for worship and the adoption of administrative titles and structures. Christianity did not reject Roman forms wholesale, it repurposed them. The internal Christian rationale for December 25th also remains central to this development. Western Christian chronological calculation had associated Jesus' death with March 25th. The symbolic assumption that conception and death occurred on the same calendar date provided a theological framework that made December 25th a coherent choice. This reasoning operated independently of solar cults, even if it converged with existing calendrical symbolism. What distinguishes the 4th century is that both rationales could operate simultaneously. Theological chronology provided internal coherence, while the Roman calendar provided external intelligibility. The result was a date that made sense within Christian theology and functioned effectively within Roman civic time. The role of imperial authority in this process must also be addressed carefully. Roman bishops operated within this environment. They were responsible for organizing worship, teaching doctrine, and regulating communal practice. The introduction of a birth feast required not only theological justification, but also administrative coordination. A fixed date allowed for consistent observance, public recognition, and integration into an emerging Christian calendar. The choice of December 25th achieved this. It allowed Christian leaders to mark the birth of Christ at a point in the year already associated with renewal and light, while grounding the observance in theological reasoning rather than in inherited memory. This dual grounding contributed to the durability of the feast. It is also necessary to note what this convergence did not accomplish immediately. The establishment of Christmas in Rome did not eliminate other forms of Christian observance related to Christ's manifestation. In the Eastern Mediterranean, January 6th continued to hold significance, encompassing themes of baptism, revelation, and in some regions, birth. The Roman adoption of December 25th represented one approach among several. The coexistence of these approaches underscores that the 4th century Christian calendar was not monolithic. Different regions adapted Christian observance to local traditions, theological emphases, and administrative realities. The Roman model would eventually become dominant, but this outcome was not predetermined at the moment of its introduction. The convergence of Christian and Roman symbolic time also illustrates a broader shift in Christianity's relationship to the surrounding culture. Earlier Christian communities had operated largely apart from civic calendars. By the 4th century, Christianity was becoming a public religion, and its observances increasingly intersected with civic life. Time itself became a medium through which Christian identity was expressed. This development carried long-term consequences. Once Christian feasts were embedded in the public calendar, they acquired stability and visibility. They could be taught, repeated, and transmitted across generations. The alignment of Christmas with December 25th ensured that the feast would be remembered not only as a theological concept, but as a recurring event in the lived experience of Christian communities. The historical evidence supports a careful conclusion. December 25th was not chosen because Christians forgot the true date of Jesus' birth, nor because they simply adopted a pagan festival. The date emerged at the intersection of theological chronology, symbolic meaning, and administrative possibility. This intersection was specific to the late Roman world of the 3rd and 4th centuries. By embedding the birth of Christ within a date already charged with symbolic resonance, Christian leaders ensured that the new feast could function effectively within the rhythms of public life. This strategy reflects adaptation rather than dependence, and reinterpretation rather than imitation. The establishment of Christmas in Rome during the mid-4th century did not immediately produce a unified Christian calendar. Instead, it exposed and intensified existing regional differences in how Christian communities organized sacred time. During the 4th century AD, multiple commemorative systems coexisted, reflecting divergent theological emphases, inherited traditions, and degrees of institutional coordination. The relationship between December 25th and January 6th lies at the center of this diversity. Before the Roman celebration of December 25th can be understood as influential beyond the city itself, it is necessary to examine the Eastern Christian landscape, where a different pattern of observance had already developed. In several regions of the Eastern Mediterranean, Christian communities observed January 6th as a significant feast well before December 25th gained prominence. This feast later came to be known as Epiphany, meaning manifestation or appearance. The earliest evidence for January 6th observance appears in Egypt and Syria during the early 4th century. In these regions, January 6th functioned as a multi-layered commemoration. It marked Jesus' baptism in the Jordan, his public manifestation, and in some communities, his birth. The grouping of these events reflects a distinct theological focus. Rather than emphasizing origin or infancy, Eastern Christianity often emphasized revelation and manifestation, the moment when Jesus was revealed as Christ. This Eastern pattern aligns with earlier Christian priorities, as in the 1st and 2nd centuries, emphasis fell not on birth as a biological event, but on moments of divine disclosure and public significance. Baptism, understood as the beginning of Jesus' public activity, carried particular weight. In some regions, the birth narrative was incorporated into this framework rather than treated as a separate occasion. The existence of January 6th observance demonstrates an important historical point. Christian commemorative practice was not uniform before the spread of December 25th. There was no single inherited nativity feast that Rome later replaced. Instead, different communities developed distinct ways of marking Jesus' significance within the year. The Roman celebration of December 25th initially represented one regional solution to a broader question: how to situate Jesus' life within sacred time. Its adoption did not invalidate existing Eastern practices, nor did it immediately displace them. Throughout much of the 4th century, both systems operated simultaneously. The spread of December 25th beyond Rome occurred gradually and unevenly. Evidence from the late 4th century indicates that Constantinople adopted December 25th by around AD 380. A sermon delivered by John Chrysostom in Antioch in AD 386 provides valuable insight into this process. In this sermon, Chrysostom notes that the celebration of December 25th had been introduced to Antioch relatively recently, and that it originated in Rome. His remarks indicate both awareness of Roman practice and the novelty of the feast in the Eastern context. Chrysostom's testimony is significant for several reasons. First, it confirms that December 25th was not universally observed across the Christian world at the same time. Second, it shows that the spread of Christmas involved argument, persuasion, and instruction, not mere imitation. Chrysostom sought to justify the December 25th celebration by appealing to Roman records and chronological reasoning, indicating that acceptance was not automatic. At the same time, January 6th did not disappear. In many Eastern regions, the two dates were differentiated rather than collapsed. December 25th commemorates the birth of Christ, while January 6th focuses on baptism and manifestation. This reorganization of sacred time represents an expansion rather than a replacement of existing observances. The case of Armenian Christianity provides a particularly clear illustration of regional independence. Armenia adopted Christianity as a state religion in the early 4th century, traditionally dated to AD 301. Armenian Christianity developed with limited direct dependence on Roman ecclesiastical authority. As a result, it preserved January 6th as the sole celebration of Christ's birth and manifestation. This practice continues in Armenian churches to the present day. Armenia's retention of January 6th is historically important. It demonstrates that December 25th was not an inevitable or universally compelling choice. Where Roman influence was weaker, alternative traditions persisted. This undermines any claim that December 25th reflects an apostolic or universally inherited date. Other regions illustrate further variation. In Egypt, January 6th held strong significance well into the late 4th century. In Jerusalem, local commemorative practices developed around sites associated with Jesus' life, adding another layer of complexity. The diversity of practices reflects the absence of a centralized authority capable of enforcing uniform observance across the Christian world at this stage. The process by which December 25th spread involved several interacting factors. Imperial influence played a role, particularly as Constantinople emerged as a new center of power. Episcopal networks facilitated communication and imitation among major cities. Theological argumentation justified adopting new dates. None of these factors operated uniformly or instantaneously. It is also important to recognize that calendar reform was not merely a theological matter. Introducing a new feast required changes in worship schedules, teaching cycles, and communal routines. In regions where January 6th already functioned as a major observance, adopting December 25th required reorganization rather than simple addition. Throughout the 4th century, Christian calendars reflected layered development. Older observances remained in place while new ones were added or redefined. This layering explains why some regions celebrated both December 25th and January 6th, while others maintained only one. The coexistence of these days. By the late 4th century AD, the Christian world entered a phase in which diversity of practice increasingly encountered mechanisms of coordination and control. The period from roughly AD 380 to AD 500 did not invent Christmas, nor did it instantly impose uniformity. Instead, it marks the consolidation of the Christmas feast through ecclesiastical authority, imperial support, and sustained liturgical practice. During these decades, Christmas moved from being a regional observance into a broadly embedded component of Christian public life across much of the Roman world. The political background of this period is essential. In AD 380, Emperor Theodosius I issued the Edict of Thessalonica, declaring Nicene Christianity the authorized religion of the Roman Empire. This act did not eliminate religious diversity overnight, but it established a legal and ideological framework in which Christian institutions could operate with state backing. Bishops increasingly functioned not only as religious leaders, but also as public figures involved in civic administration, arbitration, and social organization. This new alignment between imperial authority and ecclesiastical leadership created conditions favorable to calendar standardization. Religious observance was no longer confined to private spaces or marginal communities. Christian feasts now intersected with public rhythms of work, rest, and assembly. In this environment, inconsistency in observance became more visible and, in some cases, more problematic. Christmas was among the feasts affected by this shift. December 25th had been adopted in Rome by the mid-4th century, while January 6th remained prominent in many Eastern regions. The late 4th and 5th centuries saw increasing efforts to define the relationship between these dates and to integrate Christmas more firmly into the liturgical year. Sermons from this period provide valuable evidence for how Christmas was promoted and explained. John Chrysostom, preaching in Antioch in AD 386, explicitly addressed resistance to the December 25th celebration. He acknowledged that the feast was relatively new in the region and argued for its legitimacy by appealing to Roman practice and chronological calculation. His sermon demonstrates that acceptance of Christmas was not automatic, even in major urban centers. It required instruction and justification. Chrysostom's approach illustrates a broader pattern. Bishops did not rely solely on authority to establish Christmas. They used preaching to integrate the feast into Christian teaching, explaining its place within salvation history and its relationship to other observances. Christmas sermons emphasized incarnation, fulfillment of prophecy, and divine action in history. These themes provided theological coherence without claiming apostolic precedent. In the Western Christian world, Augustine of Hippo offers further evidence of consolidation. Writing and preaching in North Africa in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, Augustine treated Christmas as an established feast. His sermons assumed the celebration as a given part of the Christian calendar. At the same time, Augustine carefully distinguished Christmas from other observances, emphasizing its theological meaning rather than its antiquity. Augustine's writings also reveal an important feature of this period. Christmas was normalized through repetition, not through formal conciliar decree. No ecumenical council of the 4th or 5th century legislated the celebration of Christmas. Its authority derived instead from consistent practice, episcopal endorsement, and integration into the annual cycle of worship. This pattern contrasts with the history of Easter, whose date and observance were the subject of extensive controversy and conciliar intervention. The absence of comparable conflict over Christmas suggests that, while new, the feast did not challenge existing structures of belief or power in the same way. It expanded the calendar without destabilizing it. Resistance to Christmas did not disappear entirely during this period. Some ascetic communities expressed discomfort with feasting and celebration more generally. Others questioned the need for additional observances beyond those already established. However, these reservations did not coalesce into organized opposition. The momentum of institutional Christianity favored inclusion rather than exclusion. Imperial patronage reinforced this momentum. As Christian emperors sponsored church construction and supported public worship, major feasts acquired increased visibility. Christmas services held in large basilicas drew substantial congregations. The repetition of the feast year after year established expectations and habits that became difficult to reverse. The process of consolidation also involved liturgical development. Fixed readings, prayers, and hymns associated with Christmas began to circulate. While regional variation persisted, the core structure of the feast became recognizable across different parts of the empire. This liturgical stabilization contributed to the feast's durability. By the early 5th century, Christmas was widely observed in the Western Roman Empire and increasingly accepted in eastern regions alongside January 6th. In many areas, the calendar now includes both feasts, each assigned a distinct theological significance. This arrangement reduced tension by allowing continuity with older practices while accommodating newer ones. It is important to emphasize that consolidation did not mean uniformity in every detail. The manner of celebration, associated customs, and theological emphases varied by region. What consolidated was the recognition of Christmas as a legitimate and expected observance within the Christian year. The role of Rome during this period remained influential but not absolute. Roman practice served as a reference point, particularly in the West, but local bishops retained considerable autonomy. The spread of Christmas followed networks of communication, migration of clergy, and imitation among major urban centers rather than centralized enforcement. By AD 500, the position of Christmas had stabilized. It was no longer a novelty requiring explanation. It functioned as a regular element of Christian worship, supported by ecclesiastical authority and reinforced by imperial structures where they still existed. The feast had moved from introduction to entrenchment. This consolidation marks the end of the formative phase in the history of Christmas. The feast was now embedded within Christian institutional life. Subsequent centuries would not debate whether Christmas should exist, but how it should be celebrated and what meanings should be emphasized. By the beginning of the 6th century AD, Christmas had moved beyond its late antique phase of consolidation and entered a long period of expansion, elaboration, and transformation. This period did not redefine the existence of Christmas. That question had already been settled. Instead, it reshaped how Christmas was observed, understood, and integrated into Christian society. Over the course of roughly 1,000 years, Christmas evolved from a liturgical feast anchored in episcopal authority into a complex social institution embedded in religious practice, local custom, and political order. The starting point for this transformation lies in the changing structure of the Christian world after the decline of centralized Roman authority in the West. Following the 5th century, imperial administration fragmented, particularly in Western Europe. Political power shifted to regional rulers, while the church became the most stable trans-regional institution. Bishops, monasteries, and later cathedral chapters assumed roles once filled by Roman civic structures. In this environment, the Christian calendar provided continuity and order. Christmas benefited from this shift. As a fixed annual feast already recognized across much of the Christian world, it could be preserved, transmitted, and elaborated even as political conditions changed. The survival of Christmas through this transition underscores that its durability rested not on imperial enforcement alone, but on its integration into the Church's internal rhythms. During the early medieval period, roughly AD 500 to 800, Christmas became increasingly embedded within a liturgical season rather than standing as a single isolated feast. The period preceding Christmas, later known as Advent, developed gradually as a time of preparation marked by fasting, prayer, and instruction. While Advent practices varied widely by region and were not uniformly standardized, their emergence reflects growing attention to structuring time around the Christmas feast. Liturgical texts from this period show increasing complexity. Scripture readings associated with Christmas expanded beyond the birth narratives to include prophetic passages from the Hebrew Scriptures and theological reflections on incarnation. Hymns and chants associated with the feast multiplied. These developments were not uniform across Christendom, but they reflect a general trend toward liturgical enrichment. Monastic communities played a central role in this process. Monasteries functioned as centers of learning, manuscript production, and liturgical experimentation. Through monastic networks, prayers, chants, and readings associated with Christmas circulated across regions. This diffusion contributed to a degree of shared practice, even in the absence of centralized control. The Carolingian period, 8th to 9th centuries, marks a significant moment in the medieval history of Christmas. Under rulers such as Charlemagne, efforts were made to standardize liturgy and ecclesiastical practice across the Frankish realms. These reforms did not invent Christmas, but Christmas also acquired political significance during this period. Charlemagne's coronation as emperor on December 25, AD 800, is a well-documented example. This event did not create Christmas importance, but it demonstrates how the feast had become a symbolically potent date for public and political acts. Christmas offered a moment when religious meaning and political authority could be aligned. Throughout the High Medieval period, c. AD 1000 to 1300, Christmas continued to expand beyond the confines of formal liturgy. Popular devotion increasingly shaped how the feast was experienced. Nativity scenes, first attested in the 13th century, provided visual and narrative focus for the celebration. These developments made the Christmas story more accessible to populations with limited literacy. The emergence of liturgical drama further illustrates this trend. Performances depicting the Nativity, shepherds, and angels became part of Christmas observance in many regions. These dramas were not replacements for worship, but extensions of it, embedding biblical narrative within communal experience. At the same time, Christmas became more deeply connected to local customs. Feasting, gift exchange, and communal gatherings are increasingly clustered around the Christmas period. These practices varied widely by region and social class. They were not mandated by ecclesiastical authority, nor were they uniform expressions of doctrine. They represent the social absorption of the feast into everyday life. It is crucial to distinguish between the existence of Christmas as a feast and the meanings attached to it during this period. Medieval Christmas was not a direct continuation of 4th century Roman practice. Its theological core remained focused on the Incarnation, but its social expression expanded dramatically. This expansion reflects accretion rather than continuity of original form. The medieval church did not exercise absolute control over these developments. While bishops and theologians sought to guide interpretation, local practices often developed independently. The result was a layered celebration in which official liturgy coexisted with popular custom. This coexistence did not undermine the feast's legitimacy, it ensured its persistence. The later medieval period, c. AD 1300 to 1500, saw further diversification. Christmas observance varied between urban and rural settings, between monastic and parish contexts, and between regions of Europe. The feast could function as a moment of intense religious devotion, communal festivity, or both, depending on context. Importantly, none of these developments altered the calendar position of Christmas. December 25th remained fixed. What changed was the surrounding structure, the length of preparation, the forms of celebration, and the social practices attached to the date. This stability in date, combined with flexibility in expression, contributed to the feast's resilience. Throughout the medieval millennium, Christmas also became embedded in systems of economic and social obligation. Feasts required resources. Lords, monasteries, and cities used Christmas as a moment to distribute food, assert generosity, or reinforce hierarchy. These practices tied Christmas to broader social structures without redefining its religious identity. By the end of the 15th century, Christmas was firmly entrenched across Western Christendom and widely recognized in Eastern Christianity alongside January 6th. It functioned simultaneously as a liturgical feast, a social occasion, and a marker of seasonal rhythm. The medieval period did not invent Christmas, nor did it fundamentally alter its doctrinal basis. It expanded its reach, diversified its expression, and embedded itself deeply within Christian society. By the opening of the 16th century AD, Christmas was firmly embedded in Christian practice across much of Europe. Its position in the calendar was stable, its liturgical forms were well established, and its social presence was deeply rooted in local custom. What changed in the early modern period was not the existence of Christmas, but the authority structures that sustained it. The period from the 16th century onward subjected Christmas to scrutiny, suppression, revival, and transformation, reshaping the feast without erasing it. The first major disruption emerged with the Reformation. Reform movements within Western Christianity challenged long-standing ecclesiastical practices, including the authority of tradition and the legitimacy of certain festivals. Reformers did not approach Christmas uniformly. Their responses ranged from cautious retention to outright rejection, depending on theological priorities and political conditions. In territories influenced by Martin Luther, Christmas was retained as a Christian feast. Luther criticized abuses and excesses, but did not argue for the abolition of Christmas itself. In Lutheran regions, Christmas continued as a liturgical observance centered on preaching and scripture. Hymnody expanded, and the feast remained integrated into church life, though stripped of some medieval accretions. In contrast, Reformed traditions, particularly those influenced by Huldrych Zwingli and John Calvin, adopted a more restrictive approach. These movements emphasized Scripture as the sole authority for worship and rejected practices lacking an explicit biblical mandate. Since Christmas had no clear apostolic origin, it became a target of reform. In some regions, Christmas services were reduced or eliminated. The most explicit suppression occurred in Puritan-influenced England and New England during the 17th century. Puritan authorities viewed Christmas as a human invention associated with excess and disorder. In England, parliamentary ordinances during the 1640s curtailed Christmas observance. In Massachusetts, public celebration of Christmas was banned in 1659, with penalties imposed for observance. These measures were enforced unevenly and did not eliminate private observance, but they demonstrate that Christmas was no longer universally accepted. These suppressions did not last indefinitely. With the restoration of the English monarchy in 1660, Christmas observance returned to public life in England. Over time, even in regions shaped by Reformed theology, Christmas reemerged as a cultural and religious fixture. The early modern period thus reveals that institutional rejection could disrupt but not permanently erase the feast. Beyond theology, early modern changes in state formation and social organization altered the context of Christmas. As centralized states developed, religious calendars became increasingly regulated. Churches and governments negotiated the place of religious holidays within emerging systems of labor and commerce. Christmas continued to function as a marker of rest and gathering, even as its religious meaning varied by context. The 18th century marked a transitional phase. In some regions, Christmas receded in prominence, particularly where Enlightenment thought emphasized rationalism and criticized traditional observances. In other areas, especially within Catholic and Lutheran territories, Christmas remained stable. There was no single trajectory. The feast persisted unevenly, shaped by local conditions. A decisive transformation occurred in the 19th century, particularly in Europe and North America. During this period, Christmas underwent a process of redefinition. Industrialization altered patterns of work and leisure. Urbanization disrupted traditional communal rhythms. Print culture expanded rapidly. Within this environment, Christmas was rearticulated as a domestic and social celebration alongside its religious observance. Literary and cultural sources from the 19th century played a significant role in this shift. In England, writings such as Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol, 1843, contributed to popularizing themes of charity, family, and moral renewal associated with the season. These themes did not originate with Dickens, but his work reflects and amplifies broader cultural currents. Christmas increasingly functioned as a seasonal moral framework as well as a religious feast. During this period, Christmas also became associated with childhood in new ways. Gift-giving, which had existed in various forms earlier, was increasingly centered on children and tied to the Christmas date. Educational reforms, changing family structures, and new concepts of childhood contributed to this development. These practices varied by region, but shared common features across industrializing societies. The commercial dimension of Christmas expanded alongside these changes. Advances in manufacturing and distribution made goods more widely available. Retailers identified Christmas as a focal point for seasonal commerce. This did not eliminate religious observance, but it added an economic layer that reshaped public perception of the holiday. Christmas increasingly occupied both sacred and commercial space. The global spread of Christmas accelerated during the 19th and 20th centuries through colonial expansion and missionary activity. Christian missionaries introduced Christmas observance to regions in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. In these contexts, Christmas interacted with local cultures and calendars, producing new forms of celebration. The feast's adaptability contributed to its global reach. The 20th century further intensified these trends. Mass media, radio, film, and later television standardized certain images and practices associated with Christmas. These representations emphasize themes of generosity, peace. It is essential to distinguish between continuity of institution and change of expression. The modern Christmas differs markedly from its 4th century Roman form and from its medieval expressions. Yet it remains historically continuous with the institutional observance first attested in late antiquity. The date, the identification of the feast with the birth of Christ, and its position within the Christian calendar provide that continuity. The early modern and modern periods demonstrate that Christmas has been repeatedly reshaped by shifts in authority, economy, and culture. Its survival through suppression, revival, and transformation reflects not a fixed essence, but an ability to operate within changing historical conditions. By the present day, Christmas functions simultaneously as a religious feast, a cultural event, and an economic season. These layers coexist, sometimes in tension. From a historical perspective, none of these layers can be projected backward as original. Each belongs to its own period and context. The history of Christmas, when traced strictly through surviving evidence, is neither ancient nor continuous from the origins of Christianity. It is a documented historical development, beginning with absence, moving through intellectual speculation, emerging as an institutional observance in 4th century Rome, and evolving through successive phases of consolidation, expansion, disruption, and transformation. The earliest Christian centuries provide no recoverable evidence of a public celebration of Jesus' birth. This absence reflects the priorities and structures of early Christian life, which centered on death, resurrection, and communal worship rather than on birth anniversaries. When discussion of Jesus' birth date first appears in the late 2nd and 3rd centuries, it does so as a chronological inquiry, not as liturgical practice. Christmas enters the historical record as a celebration only in the mid-4th century, with its earliest secure attestation in Rome. Its establishment is tied to changes in Christianity's legal status, administrative capacity, and relationship to public time. The choice of December 25th reflects the convergence of theological chronology with existing Roman calendrical symbolism, not the preservation of apostolic memory. The 4th and 5th centuries demonstrate that Christmas did not spread uniformly. Regional diversity persisted, particularly between December 25th and January 6th, revealing that the feast was constructed through institutional processes rather than inherited as a universal tradition. Over time, ecclesiastical authority, repetition, and integration into the liturgical year normalized Christmas across much of the Christian world. The medieval period expanded Christmas beyond its late antique form, embedding it within social custom, political symbolism, and local practice without altering its calendar position. The early modern period disrupted this settlement through theological critique and suppression, yet Christmas survived and re-emerged. In the modern era, industrialization, print culture, mass media, and global transmission transformed Christmas into a complex phenomenon encompassing religious, cultural, and economic dimensions. Across all periods, one conclusion remains consistent. Christmas is not a static inheritance from the earliest Christianity, but a historically contingent institution shaped by changing contexts. Its modern form cannot be projected backward as original, nor can its origins be reduced to a single cause. The feast exists as the cumulative result of identifiable historical processes, each documented within its own time.